Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Gilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and it's part 8 of my Boomsday Project card review. This time around, 3 class legendaries and a couple other cards. If you don't have a lot of time, you just want to see the reveals, of course, hit the link in the description below to my quick reviews. Otherwise, let's go ahead and jump into some detailed reviews. Up first here, we have Myra Rotspring for Rogue, the legendary scientist. For 5 mana, it's a 4/2, and the battle cry reads, discover a death rattle minion, also gain its death rattle. So this card essentially does 2 different things. One, it generates you a resource. You get a death rattle minion that you can add to your hand. And also you get a 4/2 minion that has an activatable death rattle that you might enjoy as well. So not only is a little bit of a sticky board presence minion perhaps, but also a resource generator. And that's pretty cool. Unfortunately, I think there are still some big problems for this card, despite the fact that you get a couple different things. Namely, as a 4/2, it dies pretty easily. It's not going to be that sticky because 2 health just dies to so many different things. So that means a lot of the value for the on-board presence of this minion is going to have to be bundled into the death rattle. And certainly it can be. There are some great death rattle minions in the pool. We've seen already things like Mechanical Whelp from Doomsday Project, where this could summon a 7/7 if it dies, and for 5 mana that draws you a card. You know what? That's not a bad little turn. But there's also things, you know, like Harvest Golem that only gives you a 2/1, and that's a much less rewarding return on your investment here with a Myra Rotspring. So the question is, looking at all the different death rattle cards that are available in standard format at any given time, especially those available to Rogue, because those are going to be more likely to pop up in the Discover pool, and then just comparing, are the results of these death rattles on average going to be worth it? Because right now Myra Rotspring kind of looks like a piloted shredder, right? In fact, not even quite as good as a piloted shredder with only 2 health, and she costs an additional mana. Specifically when talking about her board presence, there's clearly the card generation aspect as well. Not forgetting, we're just going to get to that. So for the board presence side of it, a bit like a piloted shredder, and you know what? On average, I think perhaps her death rattle minion will be comparable to a piloted shredder, or her death rattle result. It may not always be a minion, for the record. So when you start to think of Myra as a, you know, perhaps comparable piloted shredder for 1 more mana, with the occasional high roll upside of rolling some crazy death rattle result, I'm starting to think a little more positively about this card. Maybe it's not that bad as a board presence card. Now, importantly, you know, a minion like this coming down on turn 5 is far worse than Piloted Shredder coming down on 4, or even Coin turn 3 back in the days, because 4 attack contested things better, you know, on turn 3 or turn 4, then 4 attack contests things moving into turn 5, turn 6. So it's not a direct comparison at all because of that slower aspect. But then you're also getting this extra card added to your hand, so there's some resource generation in there as well. And I think what that means is that although this does have some potential as a board presence kind of minion, it also feeds back into a value deck as well, which if you're running a Death Rattle synergy deck for Rogue, which I think is what you'd want to put Myra Rotspring into, then it's probably going to be a little more value oriented. It's going to play a little bit longer, more of a controlling style, at the very least a mid-range style. And Myra Rotspring as a minion probably fits into that, and the bonus you know, discover effect essentially it adds right along to your deck strategy as well. So that's something to like for Myra Rotspring, and certainly one environment in which she could succeed. That said, we've never really seen Death Rattle Rogue find a lot of success in standard format, and I don't know that we've seen enough new cards to change that. There's a couple new things that might open up that a little bit, but you know, it's always been slow. It's always had problems with life gain and stabilization, and Myra certainly doesn't change that aspect at all. So is this a card that gets run in regular Rogue decks like Miracle Rogue or anything like that? I don't think so, probably, just because ultimately you're going to have better options for any kind of high synergy deck like this, and this is not the sort of minion that sort of deck needs, because it doesn't feed into like spell synergy, for instance. It's death rattle minions in your hand that you may not want to play again. It's not as much of a general utility minion, although it can fit in any deck because it's not reliant on some specific thing to work. It's just not the kind of card that you would necessarily want to run. There's some opportunity cost to overcome with a card like this, because you might just prefer other things that synergize more strongly. So, you know, a pretty neat, just general looking card that has some application both on the board but as a value generator as well. So I think this is a fine resource for Rogue. So now let's move on to Zerek, Master Cloner, the legendary scientist for Priest. And before I get started, I adore this artwork. This ethereal looks so freaking cool because he looks like the Priest card border. He's like white / gray with yellow cuts through him, like the typical ethereal style where he's kind of wrapped and he's a golden being. And if you look at the card for Priest, the frame around the picture there has the same white with gold lines going through it, and the orange gem even connects to the flaming hand and the glyph that he's got in his hand, and even his coloring a little bit. So it's just like the perfect looking card. So that gives it probably a bonus star right there. But unfortunately for Zerek Master Cloner, as cool as he looks, I don't think he's going to see a whole lot of play, which is unfortunate because I'd like to see this card a lot. He's a 6-mana 5/5. Death Rattle reads, if you've cast any spells on this minion, resummon it. So the idea here is if you play Zarek and you cast, for instance, Power Word Shield, then that activates his Death Rattle, and when he dies, he brings back another Zarek. And if you cast another Power Word Shield, when he dies, he brings back another Zarek. And if you cast a Divine Spirit, when he dies, yeah, you get it. And that's neat in theory, like this infinitely resummoning minion. But unfortunately, in practice, I don't think that's ever really going to happen for a couple reasons. First off, that's just not that good of a play. It's hardly any better than something like Cairn Bloodhoof 97% of the time, because ultimately it's a 5/5 that brings back a 5/5, and chaining it into the 3rd or 4th or 5th instance is going to be almost impossible. Because the way this works is, right, you pass the initiative back to your opponent, and if they can kill both parts of your Zerek Master Cloner, then you don't have any more goes. You can't do anything else. It's gone, right? Unless you resummon it, for instance. But essentially, they always have the opportunity to kill both parts. Now, is every class or deck going to be able to do that? No, not necessarily. But between silences, polymorphs, just minion trades, burn spells, whatever it might be, there's a pretty good chance your Zarek is not going to live for more than 2 turns. It's just going to be very difficult. And it has to get to that 3rd or 4th turn for this card to start making sense from a value standpoint, because there are other cards that are just better and do similar things with a lot more consistency, because ultimately you can always play Cairn Bloodhoof and it's always going to have that second body attached. Zerek Master Cloner, if you don't have the right support in hand, if you can't cast a spell on it, this Death Rattle doesn't go off. It's just a 6-mana 5/5. So there's a very high likelihood that this thing backfires in multiple ways. Even if it starts working, it's eventually going to fail, and getting it to start working in the first place is really difficult as well. So I see a huge challenge there, because what kind of deck is running enough buffs, can afford to play just a 5/5 on turn 6 that doesn't just get absolutely ran over by a faster deck? You know, there's just a lot of questions and challenges that go into making this thing succeed. And often whenever we've seen a card that's just way too dependent on other things and requires multiple card combos to even make it work in the first place, that lack of consistency and predictability with one of your major assets as a 6-mana card, that's just too big of a problem. You can't do that in Hearthstone. You just can't take that much time and put that much effort and that many different resources into making one thing work, particularly when that one thing, it doesn't even end up being that good when it works. It's going to take every turn, you're going to have to feed back into your Zerek Master Cloner, and I just don't see that happening. It's just going to be so difficult to do in Priest. If you look at Priest, there really aren't even that many targeted spells to cast on a minion. Power Word Shield is the most obvious. You've got things like Divine Spirit, you've got your Unidentified Elixir, you could do Binding Heal, for instance. All of those, though, make that, you know, your deck is suddenly this weird buff deck, and can that work? Is it a combo deck? If it's a combo deck, is Zarek worth it? Because it's more value as opposed to like a finisher where you're trying to do tons of damage, which combo decks typically want to do. So ultimately, although it's a Death Rattle synergy card, and yes, it has multiple activations of a quest if it comes back, that sort of thing, activating the quest right now is not very difficult for Quest Priest to do, and Zerek Master Cloner is so slow at 6 mana that it would take so long for that to work anyway. That's a problem. This is not something that's good to summon off of the Priest legendary spell that was revealed, because getting it as a 1/1, it's going to be hard to buff and get the 5/5 back. Other Death Rattles would still be more consistent. You'd still rather run Cairn Bloodhoof. So I'm just left spinning, trying to figure out where this thing works, who runs it, why, there's better alternatives, and then on top of that, I'm thinking, why isn't this based around some sort of heal synergy? Like if you heal a friendly character this turn, that activates the death rattle, as opposed to this very specific minion casting thing, which really we haven't even seen for priest before. It feels more like a paladin buff kind of synergy card almost. So I don't know. I love the artwork, but the design just feels disconnected to me. I don't understand how or why this fits with priest or who's gonna run it. So ultimately, it's not a completely awful card. It has some potential upside in that it can resummon itself virtually infinitely, but that is just so hard to ever work that I don't think this card's gonna see play. So now let's talk about the legendary minion for Paladin. This is Crystalsmith Kangor, and like many people, I thought this guy was gonna be way bigger than a 1/2 minion. He looks like some giant, I don't even know what he is. He looks like an elemental kind of, but I guess not. And he's a 2-mana 1/2, but despite his small stature, I do think this card has some potential. He comes with Divine Shield, Lifesteal, and an effect that reads your healing is doubled. So this is very much a priest card, but it's paladin. And that last one felt like a paladin card, but it was in priest. Who knows? But the reason I like Crystalsmith Kangor is probably not the thing that you noticed first, which is that it says your healing is doubled. And that's what a lot of people are focusing on with this card. And they're suddenly dreaming up all kinds of different healing cards for Paladin and how those healing cards might work with Crystalsmith Kangor in some really big ways. Like, for instance, Lay on Hands. You can Crystalsmith Kangor into Lay on Hands and you heal for 16. And you know what? That's actually pretty okay. It's doubling your healing. That's a lot of survivability. This is an Arcane Artificer sort of card that you play it out cheaply, you combo with something else, and you gain a lot of life. And then there's Holy Lights too, and you heal for 12 for 2 mana, and suddenly that looks pretty decent if you're playing some sort of heal paladin synergy deck. But I feel like a lot of people might just be overlooking the more simple application of Crystalsmith Kangor, which is a base for buffs. Playing any kind of paladin buff on this guy suddenly makes him just an absolute monster because of the lifesteal doubling itself. So you don't necessarily need a heal card specifically to make this healing effect worth it for Crystalsmith Kangor, particularly if there are other lifesteal cards built into your deck naturally. And then Paladin has gotten a few lifesteal cards in recent expansions. So I don't think you have to run dedicated heal cards to make this thing relevant. Just cards like Chillblade Champion or Uther with his lifesteal weapon. And I think there's a couple more examples. And suddenly Crystalsmith Kangor makes a lot more sense to me, as opposed to like this Reno Jackson Arcane Artificer last ditch card that's saving you from impending doom. I think this is something you play on turn 2 that has a lot of stickiness and survivability. It's got that Annoyatron body, right? 1/2 with Divine Shield. It's going to be hard to get removed on turn 2 or turn 3, whenever you play it. And then you combo it out with a buff. Whether it's, you know, Blessing of Kings, even a Blessing of Might would be fantastic on a card like this. Paladin has a lot of options, of course. And whether you've taken damage or not, it's still a great Divine Shield base body for buffs. And then if you play this a little later in the game and you combo it out in a single turn with a buff, then it becomes a life gain card as well. If you've gotten chipped down and your opponent can't answer this sort of thing, it's going to start healing for 5, 10, 15 very quickly with a single attack. And frankly, if your deck is a lifesteal deck anyway, other things on board, you can play this, they attack and you heal to full. So I think it's less about one big moment and more about just consistently giving you an option to gain life with really no downside, because this is a playable 2-mana minion. It's not great necessarily as a 2-mana minion. It doesn't have taunt, so it's not exactly like Annoyatron, but it's still reasonable and good for what Paladin wants to do if they're playing a more mid-range style or have some sort of heal synergy. In a control deck could be fine too. So I see a dual utility. It is a good Reno Jackson kind of super heal option if you need it to be, but sometimes it's just a good minion to build on. Maybe it's played in a Quest Paladin deck where you just need those good minion bases for your buffs and you're happy. Now, that said, I think this would have been great as a mech to utilize with Magnetic in particular. Ziliax and that kind of stuff would have been incredible with Crystalsmith Kangor. Perhaps that got too good and they decided not to make this guy a mech. I mean, he doesn't look like a mech from his artwork, so I'm not saying that was the plan ever, but I think that would have made this even cooler and even better. But nonetheless, I think the card has some potential to see play in a couple different environments. It's honestly not even a terrible card in like an even aggro paladin deck, just because the body's sticky and annoying. So I think people are dreaming a little too big and kind of missing the target for Crystalsmith Kangor in a way. He's not going to be the best card ever, but I do think he's solid enough to see quite a bit of play. So now let's talk about another paladin card. This is Shrink Ray, new 5-mana spell. Love the artwork. Of course, the artwork this expansion is just out of this world stellar. And this one reads, set the attack and health of all minions to 1. So interesting card that certainly thematically connects to a lot of the stuff paladins have had before, like Equality or Aldor Peacekeeper, for instance, but it bundles it all into one card and it affects every single minion on the board. And I think this is an awfully good effect that can do a couple different things. So it can serve as, you know, a 3rd and 4th equality in a pinch. If you have things like Wild Pyromancer in a control deck and you're just looking to clear the board, that can be great. It can just, you know, serve as a way to negate big scary boards. You know, if you play even Warlock right now, they have a 7/7, a 6/6, an 8/8 out on the board at the same time. Turning all of those into 1/1s would be really fantastic, because suddenly 3/1/1s aren't nearly as big of a threat as, you know, the 21 damage I think I'd mentioned previously. And you don't even have to necessarily combo this with anything to work out well, but it's also good, of course, with a card like Consecration as a 2-board clear or 2-card board clear. So clearly a lot of different applications for this thing, and I like it that it doesn't even have to rely on that Wild Pyromancer or Consecration to make it good. It's very much a standalone answer to boards. It doesn't clear a board necessarily, but it just negates big threats. And in a control deck, sometimes that's just as important as anything else. So in a way, it's almost like this super Sunkeeper Tarim without the body, of course, but it turns stuff into 1/1s instead of 3/3s, so they're even more minimized and less of a threat. And what that means is I don't know who runs this card necessarily right now, because we don't have a viable control paladin deck at the moment. There's an OTK deck that's kind of floating around, but pretty fringe. And now that said, does like an odd paladin want to run this card as that equality substitute because they can't run equality, so that they can suddenly remove their opponent's stuff pretty easily and push through for damage? I don't think so, because even the debuff to your own minion's attack could pretty negatively impact an odd paladin deck. Like, you don't want your 3/3s turning into 1/1s. That's bad. Even if it means you can clear a board, it's still a big problem. So I don't think this is an odd paladin removal. If it was, at best it'd be a 1-of. So I don't actually think this card's going to be played very much right now in this current meta as we understand it, but it's just fundamentally good. It's one of those cards that has a lot of applications. It makes sense in the scheme of Hearthstone. So ultimately will be a solid option in future decks. It's just going to take a little bit for this one to show up at all. So now let's talk about a new mage card, the Cosmic Anomaly, another new elemental for mage. This one's a 4-mana 4/3 with spell damage +2. And this is an interesting card. This is one of the most, I'd say, explicit examples of power creep that we've seen so far in Hearthstone. And 75,000 people will now join the comments and tell me, Regis, that's not the right way to talk about power creep. And then the other people who think about the other way to talk about power creep will say, Regis, that's not the right way to talk about power creep. But in both cases, this is both strict power creep from a stat standpoint, but also Evolved Kobold, I should mention the card I'm talking about, was a played card as well. So this is actually an example of power creep on a played card. And some of you will say, well, Evolved Kobold was a neutral minion. It's allowed to be better than a neutral minion because it's a class minion. And I'm going to say, but Evolved Kobold was only ever played competitively in Mage. So as a true example of power creep, Cosmic Anomaly actually does power creep over Evolved Kobold. And all of that's irrelevant, but I just wanted to get that off my chest. So Cosmic Anomaly, better than a card we've seen in the past, Evolved Kobold. That was a 4-mana 2/2 with spell damage +2. And that was played a lot in a freeze, burn mage style of deck where you would get big discounts with Emperor Thoris, and you drop your Evolved Kobold, and you'd apply that spell damage +2 to a bunch of spells, Ice Lances, Frost Bolts, Fireballs, etc., to help you do just a bajillion damage to your opponent's face. Now, Cosmic Anomaly's probably not going to have that same sort of OTK potential because there's no big discounts like Emperor Thorson right now in the meta. But nonetheless, I do think this is still a solid card that has some potential to see play in something like a tempo/burn mage deck, because the spell damage does add up to a lot of extra burn potential. That's just a lot of damage with fireballs and frostbolts, and the body on the Cosmic Anomaly is not that bad. Now, it's not great, of course, at 3 health, but compared to Life Drinker, the most prominent 4-mana card seen right now in Tempo Mage, this theoretically offers about the same amount of damage output. It's less consistent and reliable, but the body itself serves as a slightly larger threat as well. And sometimes when you're playing Tempo Mage and you get that fast start, your 4-drops do get to attack, and the 1 or 2 extra points of chip damage from this minion attacking multiple times can make a really big difference. So I think this has potential in the right sort of Tempo Mage list. It's not always going to be there, but it's okay. I don't think this gets played in control decks or anything to empower AoEs. I don't think that's necessary. The minion just doesn't give you enough back. But given that 4-drops are a little weak in tempo decks right now, there's a couple options, but none of them feel fantastic. This might be able to edge it out in certain lists that are more reliant on spells than minion-based damage, for instance. Now, I will say, some people are like, Regis, the previous mage card that gave you spell damage +2 for your next spell you didn't like very much. Why do you like this one better when it has spell damage +2? Well, it's not only applying to one spell, first off, which is a big difference. The body is more of a threat and fits into a less competitive mana spot for mage as well. So I think it's just more likely to see play there. And frankly, you're just getting a bigger return on putting that card in your deck, right? There's just more upside, more potential. It's a 4-mana card, bigger body, does more than a 2-mana card. So when you draw it, it's doing more with that card draw than would a 2-mana 2/1. I'm blanking on the name of the card. I think it's called the Celestial something, but you guys know what I'm talking about. And that's why I think this card's a little bit better. Now, it's still not an amazing card, just a solid one that I think has a chance to see some play. And then finally, I have one last mage card here. This is the Shooting Star, new 1-mana spell that reads deal 1 damage to a minion and the minions next to it. So this is, you know, a Grievous Bite, a arcane missiles that only hits minions instead of always hitting face when you need to clear a bunch of 1/1s, and probably designed as some sort of check on Odd Paladin. Because right now when you play a Tempo Mage deck, a fast, aggressive mage, you have a lot of trouble with Odd Paladin just because they get out on the board. You can't contest it. Your minions don't do as much as their minions for building up a nice board, and ultimately you just get overrun by the swarm of dudes before you can kill the Odd Paladin. That's a really tough matchup. And I'd say Blizzard wanted to give Mage a little bit more of a really efficient, cheap, early board answer to token decks. And certainly Shooting Star is going to do that. Like, this is fantastic for killing Baku Paladin minions. The question, though, is it worth it to run this in that deck? Because a Tempo Mage deck right now is all about burn damage. It's all about killing your opponent as quickly as you can, whether that's via minions hitting for chip damage or just drawing through all those fireballs and frostbolts with Alaneth. Ultimately, the game plan is to kill your opponent, and the only time you want to address the board is when it preserves a threat. So yes, this is a pretty cool combo with something like Sorcerer's Apprentice, but it's one of those cards that, again, feels kind of bad to draw, much like I talked about with the previous card, because sometimes you're not going to need it at all, and then it has no utility, unlike something like Arcane Missiles, which can, or Cinderstorm, in fact, which can still help you deal with 1/1s, but also serves as damage in a pinch when you've managed to clear your opponent's board and you're looking for those few extra points of damage. So I don't think this necessarily fits perfectly in a Tempo Mage deck. It would be pretty incredible in like the Flame Waker Tempo Mage deck of old, I think, but the modern version, it's probably less relevant because the pings just aren't going to add up to as much value as they might with something like Flame Waker. Now, maybe there's a Vexcrow version that comes back with a cheap card like this just to help you get a lot of minions on board, and that's how you swing and win. So that's a certain possibility. So essentially, this card does something good. It does something you like. It's efficient for its cost. It has a lot of those elements. It's just who runs it. I don't think Control Mages run this because it hurts their Dragon's Fury, first off, right now in this meta. Maybe if that rotates out, there's some options. But ultimately, it's just an awkward card to slot into a deck at the moment. Does not make it bad. It probably makes Primordial Glyph a little worse most of the time because you're not often going to want this off of your Primordial Glyph either. But nonetheless, a fine card that could certainly eventually see play depending on how the meta shakes up and what a Tempo Mage would need at any given point. So not bad, just awkward at the moment. And there you go. That's my detailed reviews for these cards. So now let's jump into the quick reviews. Myra Rotspring is a 3-star card. Zerek Master Cloner is a 2-star card. Crystalsmith Kangor is a 4-star card. Shrink Ray is a 4-star card. Cosmic Anomaly is a 3-star card. Shooting Star is a 3-star card. There you go, guys. That wraps it up for part 8 of my Boomsday Project card review. Some interesting stuff that time. I honestly felt like a lot of those designs were off for the legendary minions. Myra was okay, but Zarek and Kangor felt a little weird. I think Kangor does make sense with a buff paladin, like I said, but still not really what I was expecting. I guess I expected them to be bigger or cooler for some reason. I'm not sure what it was there. But nonetheless, still exciting artwork, exciting cards. I'm curious. Maybe there will be some new synergies that are revealed that make them more interesting or promising. But nonetheless, I'm curious what you guys have to say. You have a lot of great insights. I love hearing all of your detailed thoughts. So please leave those in the comments below. But until then, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, game on.